That applause is a sound I will never forget. It was polite, little claps, the kind you give to the person who said grace, but it landed on my ears like a verdict. It came moments after my daughter's cheek reddened, after a hand struck her, after the conversational hum of our Sunday dinner fractured into something brittle. The clapping wasn't consolation, it was approval. I am Elena Vance. I have spent most of my adult life in courtrooms, at kitchen tables, on the phone in the small hours, fighting for people who had been told to stay quiet. For 32 years, I have represented survivors of domestic abuse, women whose lives were carefully rearranged by someone who smiled for the guests. I have learned the patterns. I know the language of coercion and the ways it hides in ordinary sentences. I have counseled clients through protective orders and custody wars, through negotiations where the other side tried to make truth blurry. I never imagined I would be the one standing over my own dining table, phone in a shaking hand, my daughter's cheek burning under the chandelier light. The man who hit her that night was her fiancé. We had been celebrating an engagement that, until then, looked like a good thing. Mark Harrison, handsome, steady, practiced in the art of likability, had performed the role of partner flawlessly for strangers and friends. He had engineered charm in measured doses, telling jokes that made the room lean in, offering to help clear the table, making a show of admiration when Ariana spoke about a project at work. He had a way of making a woman feel like the only person in the room, and it had worked on my daughter. People like to think abuse starts with shouting, or that you can always see a bruise coming. It doesn't. It begins in smaller, eroding ways, in the joke that isolates, in the correction rendered as concern, in the subtle tightening of a partner's world. In the beginning, Mark's actions were easy to rationalize away. He liked our family's traditions, Sundays with roast, mashed potatoes, Robert's old vinyl records playing softly. He learned my rules around the table. He laughed at the right times. He brought a bottle of wine that meshed with our pot roast. He called my husband's favorite aunt by name. He respected traditions, at least when others watched. Ariana was brilliant in ways that made people assume she was unflappable. She's a chemical engineer with a mind wired for problem solving. As a child, she emptied bookshelves and built experiments from scrap. As an adult, she walked into rooms and solved logistical problems that flummoxed entire teams. She never sought attention for her resilience. She carried it quietly. That's why when small things began to change, calls scheduled without her knowledge, offhand comments about who looked after her, it took her longer for me to notice them than it did for her to name them. I remember the first time Mark corrected her in front of me. We were at brunch, and Ariana mentioned a raise she was pursuing. Mark leaned forward, smiled, and said, "You should be careful you don't let ambition push you away from what matters." He said it as if concerned, warm, with that slight touch to the back of her hand that would have passed for affection. She laughed, flushed, and said she was joking. Later that night, she told me she felt foolish for bringing it up. The second time, during a Sunday afternoon with my family, he checked her phone under the pretense of helping find a contact. She let him. She trusted that the man who could quote lines of code and speak softly to my aging father would not read the email from her colleague that said she'd been offered a lead role in a new project. He called the colleague and asked the kind of questions that made the offer evaporate into uncertainty. She blamed herself. I called it what it was, interference. Those moments of interference were small acts of theft, of agency, of confidence. They fit into a pattern I had learned to read in depositions and at municipal hearings. A partner who, piece by piece, remakes the contours of a life until the person you loved fits into the space he permits. By the time they announced their engagement, my instinct had already begun to hum with dissonance. Engagements create an attractiveness for denial. People lean into ceremonies, into rings and shared playlists, and tell themselves a story where everything will settle. Mark understood this. He understood how the word fiancé serves as an armor of presumed commitment, a social code that discourages curiosity and emboldens protectors of the status quo. For a time, he worn that armor convincingly. We planned a small engagement celebration. My son Daniel would fly in, family friends would bring pies, and we would claim our shared Sundays as the beginning of a new chapter. I wanted to believe the best for my daughter. I had taught her how to pick locks and how to speak plainly when something felt wrong. I had taught her that the law is a tool, not a talisman. It helps, but it requires courage to use. I felt both the maternal desire to sanction joy and the professional caution that the world was not always what it seemed. The dining room glittered with low light and linen. The roast simmered in the kitchen. Steam fogged the windows. Ariana wore the dress she had chosen for the announcement. Simple, the color of late afternoon sun. Mark sat at her side like a photograph come to life. He toasted smoothly. He told stories about the first time he met her parents, how nervous he had been, how my sternness had invited him to show his respect. People laughed. Someone clinked a glass. Then he leaned into the story and told a second joke, one that sounded like teasing but landed like judgment. He made a remark about teaching her to behave in front of his family. Mild, tossed off, a laugh line. Helen, his mother, laughed louder than anyone. "That's right," she said. "Some women need manners." There was a hollowness to her voice, the sort of pleased sound people make when they observe a performance they expected. Ariana's smile faltered. I watched a flicker travel across her face, the way a shoreline shivers under a sudden current. She tried to answer with a joke of her own, something to ease the air, but the room had shifted. The laughter took on an edge. Mark's hand, which had been resting by her knee, moved up, not as an embrace, but as a claimed territory. He left a mark with those fingertips, not on her skin, but on the feeling of the moment. He tightened the conversation with a sharp aside about respect. He mocked a story of her college years in a tone that implied incompetence. Then, without much ceremony, he struck her. It was not the climax of a long night. It was a single, denied moment that became undeniable. It was a slap, sharp, stinging, a sound that echoed like a dropped glass. It silenced the room in a way laughter never could. People froze. The one who applauded was Helen Harrison. She clapped as if applauding a lesson taught and learned. The applause was slow and deliberate. It was a sound that repurposed violence into virtue. My hands went to my mouth and then to my phone. Decades in family law teach you two things. First, time is evidence. Second, you will never regret preserving it. I had no immediate interest in becoming a spectacle. My interest was the truth in its rawest form, what had been said and done in the room, and making sure that the truth could be used to protect my child. I hit record. There is always a legal and ethical tension when recording. In some jurisdictions, you must inform all parties before creating a recording. In others, single-party consent suffices. I have counseled clients on the complications of admissibility. Tonight did not feel like a debate about jurisdiction. It felt like a decision: preserve or let the moment dissolve into she said, he said. My phone was a small, warm rectangle in my palm. My voice, when I spoke into it, was smaller than the room but steadier than I felt. "Commander Miller, now." I did not need to explain. Commander Miller had been our law enforcement ally for years. He had worked with me on cases where evidence was thin and resolve had to be thick. He answered in a voice that carried authority. "Elena?" "He's just—" My voice would have failed me if not for practice. "Mark Harrison. He hit Ariana. Her cheek." I heard her inhale beside me, the sound of someone regrounding. Helen applauded. "We are at my house. Send someone now." He asked the precise questions officers always ask first: whether anyone was still in immediate danger, whether weapons were present, whether I wanted a protective order, and then he said, "Hold on, we'll be there." His presence on the line was a small lifeline that reconfigured my panic into action. While he was on the way, I did what we always taught survivors in our clinic: secure, document, witness. I asked Ariana to step into the other room with me. I kept my voice quiet and factual. I did not admonish. I asked for the facts. "Do you want me to call an ambulance?" I asked. She shook her head. I had a bag in my mind already: documents, her phone, the ring box, the dress. I told her to keep her hands visible. I offered water. I told her we would get a protective order. I told her we would speak to the police. Those are sentences that can sound rote until they are the only thing you can say. When the squad car pulled up and the door closed, the choreography of procedure came into focus. Officers took statements in a sitting room where the dishes rattled with later endurance. Commander Miller walked in with a semblance of personal grief in his eyes. He has always been good at seeing the person before the problem. He thanked me for calling. He listened to Ariana tell the sequence of events, how the evening had felt, the slight cumulative erosions that had softened her resistance, and he took careful notes. At some point, an officer went to speak to Mark, who had not left the table. There was no offer of an apology that cut true. There were practiced phrases, and then a resistance. An arrest was made for assault. The charge was what I had known it could be: a criminal complaint alleging domestic assault. I watched them take him through procedural motions. I watched Helen stand at the window like a statue. I will not pretend that the arrest was a complete victory. Arrest is a tactical step, not a victory lap. The law can offer immediate protection, temporary custody of the scene, a period in which an order may be secured, but it cannot erase the shape of what happened. Evidence is fragile. Memories can be pressured. Social narratives are relentless. Still, on that night, as Mark was led away and the click of a metal cuff sounded like a punctuation mark, I felt something unclench in my body. Not triumph, not relief. A pragmatic sense that the sequence of events I had always advised clients to assemble, time-stamped recordings, witness statements, medical notes if necessary, immediate police involvement, was beginning to exist for my daughter. The next hours were a strange, clinical sort of intimacy. Officers stayed to take statements. Commander Miller advised we file for an emergency protective order before morning. I drafted the complaint in my head while we sat at the kitchen table with the remnants of our roast cooling in the oven. I dictated facts. Ariana recited details in the spare, exacting voice I recognized from depositions: who said what, which hand moved, how guests reacted, the clapping. She wept when she told me about Helen applauding. Her shame and disbelief washed over her in waves. I did not try to tilt her away from those emotions. I named them. "You did not deserve that," I said. "We will show them the record." People who have never seen the inside of an abuse case sometimes think it is only about one incident. It is not. It is about pattern. It is about motive and opportunity and the slow shaping of consent. It is about the ways people around the abuser, friends, family, neighbors, can become accomplices through silence or through active rationalization. Tonight, Helen's applause made her an active participant in that rationalization. By dawn, we had a temporary protective order. The language was careful: prohibited contact, distance specifications, and provisions for the ring and personal effects. A return date for a hearing was scheduled. I filed affidavits. I attached the recording. The clerk stamped papers that would later fold into the municipal docket, and I felt a professional clarity the way surgeons feel before they operate: facts assembled, next steps delineated. Even as we moved through those formalities, I recognized the thinness of the shelter I was building. The legal paper could bar him from the house. It could not stop a smear. It could not prevent Helen from constructing her own narrative in private phone calls. It could not prevent the other family members from aligning with Mark. Patterns repeat. Influence is a difficult thing to undo. Which is why I was not surprised, to my professional consternation, when the first ripple of pushback arrived within 48 hours. It was small, an anonymous email to my law office with insinuations about my professional motives, a vague threat about a bar complaint. The voice was thin and practiced, the sort that assumes power derives from noise. The message suggested impropriety in how evidence was collected. It suggested that the wife of a lawsuit trope would make for better headlines than a sober reading of the affidavit. It named no crime, but implied many. I archived it. I flagged it. I did not react with fury. I reacted with strategy. Experience teaches you that attempts to discredit a survivor or a lawyer are often the first line of defense for people who feel the law might pull at their privileges. It is easier to attack reputation than to account for behavior. They will try to cancel you by weaponizing bureaucracy and gossip. They will hire PR. They will mine your life for fodder. This is a cost of calling formal systems into play. Ariana slept badly. She woke with the sensation of her throat being tight, like someone had shadowed it while she slept. She kept asking the question survivors ask most often. Did I overreact? Did I misread him? Did I authorize this by staying, by not speaking up sooner? Those questions climb like vines and can choke the most resilient hearts. I told her the things I had learned to say when law and love feel entangled. You did what you could do at each step. Culpability lies with the person who chose to hurt you. We will use what the law allows to protect you and to build the case. The first press contact came a day later. A reporter, apparently tipped off, rang the office phone. They wanted to know if I would comment on the incident at her home and whether my professional role made the situation a conflict of interest. I responded with the slow, deliberate language of someone who knows how headlines get made. I would not give an on-the-record interview until the protective order and the criminal process had time to proceed. I referred the reporter to the public affairs officer at the police department. That is what I tell clients. Control what you can. Do not give sound bites that allow privileges to be deflected into character attacks. Within a week, some of my worst anticipations began to stack into real pressure. A blog piece, anonymous in its origin but venomous in tone, suggested that Ariana had engineered the incident for attention, that a mother who is in the business of abuse might stage events. It used our family photos in a framing that was both invasive and disorienting. Comments followed. Anonymous accounts sent messages that implied they knew details about my personal finances. A levee of coordinated insinuation had been raised and, like water, found cracks. This is the ledger of cost people seldom see when they imagine justice. The law's immediate tools had been effective in creating a temporary order of protection, but the social tools, rumor, influence, assertive counter-narratives, were already trying to carve out space where legal documents could not speak. I had seen these tactics in other cases. Audits triggered by anonymous complaints, professional complaints filed with bar associations, quiet threats to clients at their workplaces. I could trace the playbook by mind because I had seen it before. That knowledge comforted me and frightened me in equal measure. When the first lawyer's letter arrived, formal, barbed, written by counsel retained by Mark's family, it contained an accusation that I had manipulated evidence. It invited me to cease and desist and threatened litigation. It was the kind of letter meant to do more than convey legal position. It was meant to unsettle, to imply that the path I had chosen would be expensive. They complained about my partiality and suggested that any protective order might be structurally unfair because of my profession. The letter was both predictable and personal. It assumed I would be rattled by the possibility of professional entanglements. It tried to convert that fear into a lever. I could have answered in fury. I could have drafted a reply that matched tone for tone. Instead, I called my colleague, Lucy, and asked her to begin to assemble our own record. We collected emails, timestamps, the audio file I recorded that night, guest statements, and the statements the officers had taken. We prepared to confront the bar complaint with the same rigor we would a motion. There are times when being a lawyer for someone you love feels indistinguishable from being a mother. Both roles demand resourcefulness and the courage to stand in the line of fire. At night, sometimes I would wake and think about the way a line can be crossed so quickly. A law can say do not contact, and yet influence finds freeways around statutes. A protective order can keep a person physically distant, and yet a social sentence can be as cruel as a trespass. The stakes seem to have shifted from a singular violent act to a contest over narrative and power. Still, for all the worry, I found small reserves of hope in the way Ariana began to move through the world after the incident. She returned to labs, step by deliberate step. She sat with a counselor we recommended, and she let herself speak. It took time to disentangle shame from responsibility. She read me text messages from colleagues who offered support. She made a list of things she wanted back from the house, a sweater, a ring portion, and she authorized me to pursue them legally. These modest acts of reclamation were, to my mind, the first stages of real recovery. And then, in the quiet between the legal filings and the first chorus of public pushback, a new kind of message arrived. It was not a lawyer's letter this time. It was a plain envelope left at our outer gate in the early morning hours. No return address. Inside, a flash drive with a single label, Listen. My first responses were professional, evidence chain concerns, questions about authenticity, analysis of metadata. My second response was maternal. What would be on that drive? Would it be more accusations? Would it be something that would deepen the wound? I gave the drive to Commander Miller to handle in a law enforcement context. We were careful about chains of custody. We were deliberate about admissibility. The chain of custody procedures were the same ones we use in other high-stakes cases, documenting possession, limiting handling, making sure that any copy could be authenticated. I did not open it myself because I know how evidence can be contaminated or mischaracterized, and because a rushed reaction can be used against you. I watched the boxes of little tasks accumulate around me, affidavits, council meetings, the choreographing of safe travel for Ariana when she needed to move between home and work. I sat in courtrooms that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper and watched a system that moves by days and inches try to match the velocity of a human crisis. I listened to opposing counsel seek delay tactics. I watched Helen sit in court with a face that betrayed nothing. I watched Mark appear through a haze of cameras and lawyers and carefully measured statements. The system is slow and messy, but it exerts pressure because it creates record. There were nights I was gratefully tired, and nights that burned with a kind of private, hot fear, especially when anonymous voices in my inbox suggested they had photos or messages they intended to release. Those threats are their own kind of violence, a weaponization of privacy. They call up the question, what will it cost us to be truthful? It was in that tension between the thin protection of a court document and the widening social pressure that the shape of the fight began to appear. I had started it in both the professional and maternal capacities I occupy, the lawyer who knows the law's mechanisms and the mother who knows the human heart's fragility. What I did not yet know, and what the next weeks would make clear, was how far Mark's family would be willing to go to protect his reputation, and how many institutions they could influence with a letter and a whisper. By the time the first formal complaint at my office took root, a bar complaint filed by an unknown party accusing me of impropriety, the dinner that had once been an engagement celebration felt like a hinge on a larger door. Behind that door were professional threats, whisper networks, and a campaign designed to make truth an expensive thing to hold. Yet, even then, as we began to draw up responses and to schedule preliminary hearings, I felt something steady under me. The fact that we had recorded the moment, that witnesses had been present, and that a police report existed. Those were not guarantees of victory. They were the scaffolding of accountability. And I thought, with the clarity of someone who has done this work long enough to see the map become terrain, when power responds with pressure, you respond with evidence and endurance. You do not quiet the noise with the voice of outrage. You meet it with the discipline of process. If this story is touching something in you, if it makes you think of someone who needs help, or if you recognize the pattern in your own life, tell me where you are. Leave the city name in the comments. Sometimes the first step is finding out you're not alone. The weeks that followed were a study in escalation and adaptation. We filed motions, met with public defenders and prosecutors, structured Ariana's presence at work for safety, and tried to anticipate the next blow, because the playbook is often predictable. They would attack credibility, attempt to reframe the narrative as a manipulation, or employ bureaucratic levers to make the process punishing. I had seen it before. This felt like a familiar enemy, a small network of influence that could move quickly if it wanted to drown a voice. A testy hearing produced a temporary extension of protective measures, but it also produced a volley of motions from Mark's counsel arguing for dismissal on procedural grounds. Their filings were neat and technical, grammar that lives comfortably in the world of procedure. Their press sent op-eds to local outlets questioning the propriety of a family law attorney representing her own case. They suggested without substantial evidence that my professional life and maternal one had collided improperly. They painted motion practice as a moral failing rather than a procedural necessity. The law isn't immune to moral theater. We answered every motion with the same steadiness with which I teach law students to litigate. Source the facts, be precise, avoid emotive flourish, and let the record do the work. When they produced a witness who testified that the slap must have been mutual because she had been sarcastic, I offered what evidence would rebut such insinuations: the recording, the timeline, and witnesses whose statements had been uncoerced. Witness credibility becomes the center point of these fights, and your job as advocate is to ensure witnesses are protected, prepared, and present. And then the smear broadened. Anonymous posts began to thread through the community. A friend of mine lost sponsors for a nonprofit she ran because donors were nervous to be associated with a controversy that smelled like scandal. Ariana faced whispers at work, offhand comments about drama and unstable behavior. People who had known us for years sent hesitant messages asking if something else were going on. That ache of the private life becoming public and misread has no legal remedy. It is a human cost that takes time to rebuild around. What I did not expect, yet should have, was how quickly support began to come from corners I had not anticipated. Survivors I had represented years ago reached out with quiet messages. A woman who had once sat across from me in a clinic room sent flowers with a card that read, simply, "Thank you for making that call." A junior colleague offered pro bono assistance to handle the professional complaints. Commander Miller assigned an officer to arc the case with extra care. It was as if the very loose network that feeds on rumor also contains a lattice of people who will step in when the chips fall. Even while we marshaled the legal and human resources of defense, I kept watching for where the pressure would find a weakness. The first lawyer's letter had been the beginning. The anonymous envelope with the flash drive felt like the second beat. There were other beats ahead, I knew. Motions meant to exhaust, audits meant to intimidate, whispered accusations meant to isolate. Our strategy thus had to be both reactive and anticipatory, prevent, preserve, and prepare for the inevitable spin. But for all the procedural structure and tactical response, I could not help but return to that moment at the table, the clap, the strike, the way power can make cruelty look like propriety. In those hours, with the legal apparatus clicking into place, I found myself teaching Ariana another kind of lesson: how to carry truth without being crushed by it. It is a skill both small and great, how to put one foot in front of the other when the world is watching and those who should stand beside you may step back. Some fights are fought in courtrooms, some are fought in kitchens. Our fight would be both. And as the day gave way to a thin, uncertain night, the files multiplied on my desk and the voices in my inbox grew louder. The legal engines had been started, but the social engines, the ones that wield influence and contact lists and the appetite for rumor, were revving too. The coming days would ask for more than paper and procedure. They would ask for endurance, for the stories to be told with care, and for witnesses to be protected. I went to bed that night the way lawyers do sometimes, awake enough to hear the work in my bones, mindful of the long list that would need to be tended in the morning. I thought of the people who will read this and think of their own apologies to themselves for staying, or their own hesitations about speaking out. I thought of the small domestic rituals we reclaim when the worst has been endured, the way we put plates back in the cupboard, the way we set the table again, the way a pot roast becomes a ceremony of survival. In the early hours, before the sun fully rose, I wrote a note to myself, less for memory than for tethering. Keep the record, protect the witness, remember the woman she is apart from this. The rest of the week would be a cascade of filings, of strategic calls, of private consolations and public statements. It would be the first test of whether we could withstand an organized counterattack aimed not merely at one event, but at the credibility of the survivor and, by extension, the credibility of anyone who stepped in to help. There is a peculiar steadiness that comes from acting with a measured purpose in such moments. It does not make fear disappear. It rearranges it into work. It changes a parent's helplessness into steps. It changes a lawyer's outrage into motions and exhibits, and it sets the stage for something larger than any of us. The case, in its infancy, required more than zeal. It required patience, because the law runs a slow current through a quick world. It required advocacy, because people would try to drown out the truth with noise. It required a willingness to stand in public and be seen as imperfect, because the most common tactic of abusers and their defenders is to stain the messenger. Above all, it required that I remember my daughter as a whole person, not merely as a victim, but as a person reclaiming her life step by step. As the day turned toward noon, an email landed in my inbox from a reporter asking for comment about an anonymous post that had begun to circulate. There would be headlines, whispers, and motions yet to file. There would also be, perhaps, allies who stepped forward to lend their time and their expertise. The first order of business was to preserve what we already had: the recording, the witness statements, the police report. The next was to prepare for the expected second wave: professional complaints, social attacks, and legal maneuvers meant to exhaust us. I sat at the kitchen table, the old oak scarred with years of dinners and arguments and reconciliations. I put my hand over my daughter's on the table and felt a pulse that was not wholly broken. We would not let that pulse be extinguished by applause or by influence. We would gather evidence. We would call witnesses. We would stand. The law is messy, the world often unjust, but the work of preservation, the accumulation of facts, the protection of the vulnerable matters in ways that ripple beyond any one case. Outside, the neighborhood kept its steady cadence of life. Mailboxes clicked shut, a dog barked down the street, and someone practiced piano in a nearby house. Ordinary things. The shift in our family had already taken place, but the truest shifts are the slow ones. How we continued to have Sunday dinners, how we kept singing when we could, how we rebuilt trust in small increments. We were not yet out of danger, that was clear. There were more motions to be filed, more messages to sift through, more strategies to test. There were adversaries who knew how to use influence, and a mother-in-law who had applauded the wrongness of the moment. There were, I suspected, more revelations to come, evidence tucked away in corners, files that might be unearthed, people who might change their minds. But for the first time since the slap, I could set a simple goal for the next day: protect my daughter, hold to the record, and prepare for the next move. The rest of the arc, the campaigns, the evidence reveals, the trials, lay ahead. For now, we built the foundation. The next weeks would test it. The weeks that followed congealed into a kind of heavyweight routine. Motion deadlines, media calls declined, council meetings, and the small private work of keeping a life safe. The public parts were loud, the op-eds, the anonymous posts, the lawyer-crafted letters sent not so much to persuade as to intimidate, and the private parts were quieter but harder. Ariana's tremors while brushing her hair, the way she started arriving at the lab 15 minutes early and leaving with a determination that felt like armor. Our strategy had to be two things at once: defensive enough to blunt the immediate professional attacks, and opportunistic enough to seize whatever openings the other side left. They left openings: careless phrases on social media, an overreaching request for discovery, a misfiled affidavit. In litigation, mistakes are windows. You don't pretend you can pry open every one, you decide which will matter most. The anonymous flash drive arrived like a present from an unseen hand and changed the map. Commander Miller's team ran it through forensic analysis. Metadata was the first thing we examined, then waveform signatures, then corroborative voices. The first listen in an evidence room felt like listening to someone else's nightmare. Old voices, half-remembered phrases, a woman's laugh undercut by a register that sounded tired and sharp. The files were messy: snatches of conversations, a rough interview, an audio of someone speaking in a low, measured voice about a death that had until then been a family story with one version. There were admissions, clauses of talk that, if authenticated, were devastating. We could have treated the drive with suspicion and shelved it. Instead, because we honored the chain of custody from the moment the envelope was found, we treated it as what it claimed to be: potential evidence. Commander Miller cross-checked the voices with available samples, phone messages, voicemails, public interviews. When the lab's acoustic analyst suggested a high probability that one of the voices belonged to Helen Harrison, I felt both a cold jolt and a kind of grim relief. If true, the drive opened another line of inquiry. It suggested patterns, not merely an isolated moment. It reframed Helen from a supportive mother at an engagement to someone who had a stake in preserving a family story, and perhaps in preserving silence. At the same time, Mark's counsel reacted predictably. They moved to preclude the drive as inadmissible, arguing chain contamination, asserting the possibility of tampering, and emphasizing hearsay. This is what happens when the stakes rise. The fight moves from the rawness of human testimony to the technicalities of law. Admissibility is often the hinge of justice. It is where truth meets rules, and rules are merciless. Our response required an old lawyer's patience and the reflexes of someone who knows how to turn forensic detail into narrative. Lucy and I worked with the lab analysts to prepare a comprehensive authentication report. We subpoenaed the tech company that hosted an archival voicemail in which Helen's voice could be sampled. We found a witness who had shared a private conversation with Helen years earlier in which she used a distinctive phrase later heard on the drive. That witness, the cousin, Albert Harrison, proved to be the key stone. Albert's testimony came tentatively at first. He had long been a peripheral figure in the family story, not a central player, but close enough to have overheard things in corridor conversations, a man who had grown uncomfortable with what he knew. He had reached out anonymously because he feared reprisal. When he finally agreed to speak with Commander Miller, he did so with trembling hands and a voice that broke at odd moments. He described one night in which Helen and another family member had argued. He remembered a phrase. He remembered the direction of the conversation. He remembered seeing an object that, in context, made him uneasy. He told us what he could remember and what he could not, and in doing so provided the corroborative thread the lab needed. Albert's decision to come forward was not heroic in a cinematic sense. It was slow and human, an accumulation of guilt, a sense of responsibility, and the fear that silence had become a weapon. People who have followed these cases for years recognize the moral complexity of such choices. Albert was not a saint. He was a man who finally decided his conscience mattered more than family loyalty.
For Ariana and me, his testimony was both gift and a reminder of how complicated truth can be. When we presented the authenticated audio in a pretrial hearing, the other side argued loudly that the flash drive was a trap, a planted piece of evidence. Their strategy was to inject doubt that might extend the litigation, to create delay, and to make the public narrative more ambiguous. Delay is a tactic. It saps resources and morale. But the authentication showed waves of voice patterns, background noises that matched the known recording environment, and a corroborating witness who could speak to context. The judge allowed portions in that were directly probative. She excluded others as unduly prejudicial. The line between what the court admitted and what it excised was narrow, but it mattered. The judge was mindful of relevance and careful about invitation to speculation. What remained, however, was enough to start a new investigation. Once the court allowed a portion of the evidence, the police reopened the old file on Helen's husband's death. I am aware of how delicate my words must be. Reopening an investigation does not equal an immediate conclusion. It equaled a legal mechanism being put back into motion. Detectives re-interviewed witnesses. Forensics re-examined archived materials. Our role as private citizens and litigants was to support the inquiry in ways that respected legal boundaries. We provided the authenticated evidence and suggested lines of inquiry. We did not dictate charges. That belongs to the prosecutors. The social backlash intensified while the legal system ground forward. Mark's family mobilized a PR campaign. Blogs that had once whispered now screamed, suggesting impropriety in our handling of evidence and questioning motives. Anonymous complaints were filed with the state bar. An IRS audit inquiry, triggered by an anonymous tip, landed like a thunderclap. My firm received notices asking for documentation that coincided suspiciously with the timeline of the most aggressive social media posts. Audits are mundane procedures most of the time. In this context, they are a weapon, a way to tie up financial attention, to create doubt in clients, and to drain the resources of those who would speak. The audit caused real pain. For a few frantic weeks, partners and I spent late nights pulling files, reconciling accounts, answering queries. My practice's staff felt the pressure. Some clients grew nervous and asked difficult questions. Friendships frayed. People who did not want controversy in their lives pulled away. There is a real financial and human cost to this kind of retaliation. It is designed to hurt beyond the courtroom. It is meant to say to the accuser, you can try to go public, but the cost will be crushing. I tell you all of this not to complain, but to map the reality. When someone in power turns every institutional lever, the effects are broad. We combated each one, responding to audits with transparent accounting, answering bar complaints with calm, evidence-based replies, and pushing back against PR narratives by publishing precise, limited statements when necessary. We did not match their volume with volume. We matched their actions with process. That is a slower strategy, and it requires endurance. The courtroom sketched the emotional high points of months spent in battle. Mark's criminal case moved forward on the domestic assault charge. The municipal docket became one line in a cascade of hearings. The state prosecutor charged Mark with assault and violations of the protective order that followed. In separate proceedings, investigators recommended obstruction charges against Helen in connection with the old death inquiry. Prosecutors accepted portions of the findings and focused on conduct that could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Trials are by design constrained. They force truth into narrow questions. Did the accused strike the complainant? Did the accused obstruct an investigation? The dramas, the applause at a dining table, the weight of a mother's slow realization translate into testimony, exhibits, and the slow, steady mechanics of cross-examination. Attorneys are craftsmen. They know how to pull at memory, how to expose motivations, how to protect witnesses. I had spent a career on both sides of these tables. Being on the table now, representing my child and walking a court corridor with a different fear in my chest, was its own kind of lesson in humility. One hearing became a hinge. The defense tried to portray the authenticated audio as a manufactured set of snippets stitched to create meaning that did not exist. They suggested Albert was a disgruntled relative. They intimated that the timing of his disclosure aligned conveniently with the assault case. We did not deny motive. We acknowledged Albert's late step forward, and we contextualized it. Motive does not negate truth. What mattered was corroboration, the audio's matching of independent samples, the timeline consistency, and witnesses who could place phrases in time. The prosecutor's presentation emphasized pattern over scandal. The audio did not merely shock, it connected to a web of testimonies and physical records. The defense then attempted to use the smear machine in court, press leaks, subtle hints to reporters, and the old tactic of painting the victim as unstable. This is an ugly, centuries-old playbook. In cross-examination, we saw attempts to extract admissions that would be repurposed into headlines. Had Ariana once said something boastful? Had she exaggerated an earlier fight? Did she ever lie to her parents? It is a vile process because it takes personal wounding and interrogates it as if betrayal is simple rather than layered. We prepared her for those questions with care. She practiced articulating what needed to be said and what did not. She had a counselor on call. We protected her by limiting unnecessary exposure and by objecting to questions designed only to humiliate. When the jury rendered its verdict in Mark's case, the relief was as practical as it was emotional. He was found guilty of the assault and for violating the protective order and subsequent conduct. The sentence was not a balm for what had happened. It was a legal consequence that recognized wrongdoing. In sentencing, the judge spoke of the ripple effects of domestic violence, the way it travels through families, how it leaves marks that a calendar cannot erase. It was not a satisfied moment of revenge. It was a formal acknowledgement that the state would impose consequences. Helen's case took a different path. The prosecutors pursued charges related to obstruction and to conduct that had materially impeded the inquiry into her husband's death. I will not inflate the nuance. Convictions in cases like this can and should be precisely described. In hearings, she was charged with actions that, combined with the authenticated recordings in Albert's testimony, created a mosaic prosecutors felt could be proven. The trial examined her conscious actions, concealment of evidence, misdirection, and the fostering of a narrative that suppressed unanswered questions. The jury found her guilty of obstruction and related charges. Sentencing reflected the seriousness of impeding justice and the long harm caused to a bereaved family and the community at large. Neither verdict felt like an end to our pain. Convictions do not reverse shame or entirely restore reputation. They do, however, alter the balance of public record. They allowed Ariana to step out of a public fog and eventually to rebuild without the shadow of immediate legal ambiguity. The cost, as the DNA warned, was truly high. We lost clients and friends who preferred the comfort of distance over the discomfort of standing with us. A nonprofit I helped moderate lost a grant after a donor worried about association. Social media attacks continued intermittently, as relentless as a drizzle. My firm's billable hours dipped while I devoted energy to my daughter's safety. The financial and emotional ledger was long. But so was the ledger of small kindnesses, former clients who became beacons of support, colleagues who offered pro bono help, an investigator who drove hours to meet a witness, and a community counselor who offered sliding scale sessions for Ariana. One of the most powerful moments of recovery was small and domestic. Months after the trials, Ariana agreed to come back to a Sunday dinner that was not a staged recovery, but a reclaimed ritual. She chose the menu, comfort food she loved, and invited one friend and her brother. The table was quieter than before, the laughter less perfunctory and more careful. We set the table with the same worn plates. Over roast and mashed potatoes, she told a small story about a triumph at work, a process she had redesigned to make testing safer for technicians. The delight in that room felt earned. Recovery was not linear. There were nights when Ariana would wake from a dream and we would sit in the kitchen with the kettle humming and talk it through like a case file. What happened? What we would do next? What boundaries to set? Therapy helped, support networks helped, time helped. She started mentoring younger women at her workplace informally, and in doing so began to reclaim power not as retribution, but as guidance. She accepted the kind attention of someone named Sebastian, a colleague who had been steady and patient. Their relationship unfolded in good small ways: text messages about lunch, someone to check in after a long day, a presence at a low-key museum exhibit. It was slow, respectful, and lived into an image of love that is gentle rather than grasping. I began to hear from people in ways I had not expected. Women I had helped years earlier sent messages of solidarity. A young woman in another state reached out to ask about steps to document the abuse she had endured, and we spoke for an hour about evidence and safety planning. These conversations were not triumphal, they were connective. They reminded me why we do the work, that when a person finds their voice, it can help others find theirs. There were professional rebounds as well. Some clients left after the turbulence, but others stayed. New clients arrived as word spread about the work we had done. The audit cleared with minimal findings. The bar complaint was dismissed when procedurally unfounded arguments could not withstand scrutiny. These administrative resolutions were not the point of the story. They were the byproduct of a stubborn insistence on documentation and process. Ariana and I made a deliberate choice 1 year after the dinner to tell the story publicly. She could have kept it private forever, and there would be no greater moral condemnation in choosing silence, but she chose to speak, and she did it on her terms. We worked with a small, principled journalist collective that agreed to tell the story with restraint and purpose, emphasizing survivor dignity over scandal. In that piece, she described the way control had felt like a tightening cord, the shame that had visited her, and the way she had come back to herself through therapy, legal protection, and small acts of everyday reclamation. We then decided to write down the legal and emotional lessons in a memoir format, me in a legal explanatory voice and Ariana in a personal one. The book was not a tell-all full of salacious detail. It was a guide for others who might find themselves suddenly thrust into the same intersection of family and law. It carried resources, practical steps for preserving evidence, a plain English guide to restraining orders, and reflections on how to rebuild. We received letters, many anonymous, some not, that said simply, "Thank you." That, more than any headline, felt like repair. None of this means everything was smooth. There were embarrassing public moments, misquoted lines, a podcast that spun an old clip into gossip, a troll who refused to let go. There were internal debates on how much to expose, how to protect other parties who had not consented to public scrutiny, and how to avoid enabling the sensationalism the other side had weaponized. We erred on the side of dignity. We redacted where necessary and avoided republishing the kinds of comments that had once been used to wound us. In time, Ariana moved into a new apartment with natural light and a modest balcony where she grew herbs. She returned to work more fully and later accepted a leadership role in safety standards in her company, a position that allowed her to make structural changes rather than merely endure the consequences of others' neglect. Sebastian stayed, a steady presence rather than an answer. Their relationship was careful, patient, and rooted in respect. She learned to love again in a way that did not make a spectacle of her past. I, too, found my own way forward. The bar complaint behind me, the audit resolved, I began to take on a few cases that felt like redemption work, representing survivors who had been silenced by complex networks of power. I spoke at a symposium about the way social influence can be weaponized in domestic cases and how courts must guard the integrity of evidence and witness protection. I also started a small fund, seeded modestly and run transparently, to help survivors access immediate legal help for emergency filings. It was not charity in a dramatic sense. It was a practical resource born of frustration with bureaucracy. Our family returned tentatively to certain rituals. Not everything went back to the way it had been. The table remembers, and so do we. But we found ways to fill the silence with things that mattered. A new record played on slow nights, a pot roast cooked and shared, a laugh that was not forced. We spoke honestly with my son Daniel about boundaries and the moral obligations that come with love. We visited places that reminded us of Robert, the man whose steadiness had shaped our family, and spoke of him with affection and without sentimental gloss. A public life invites opinions. It also invites gratitude. I kept receiving notes from women who had used our checklist, photographs, timestamps, witness lists, to protect themselves. A woman from a town 2 states over told me she had used a recording to obtain a protective order in time to save her child from escalation. These small victories added up. They were not the sweeping justice some imagine. They were the tangible, useful outcomes of strategy and courage. There are things I must not oversell. The law is not a cure-all. People are not guaranteed safety because of a piece of paper.
Institutions can be slow, porous, and subject to influence. The cost of pursuing justice can be high and sometimes unbearable. I do not pretend we paid no price. We did. But there is also a truth that cannot be understated. Evidence, when properly preserved and ethically used, changes possibilities. So does the courage of witnesses who finally speak. Sometimes, in the quiet that falls between deadlines, Ariana and I returned to the old oak table and set it as if we were making an offering to the small, ordinary things that stitch life together. We do not pretend the past is undone. We accept that scars remain. But we also see the ways the present has been reclaimed. The Sunday dinners that are quieter and kinder, the way my daughter now laughs without watching for a hand to strike, the new partnerships that speak of health rather than control. I share this not to make anyone feel smaller for choosing silence or to suggest a single path to safety. Every survivor's journey is different. What I hope to convey is that there are tools, legal, social, and emotional, that can be marshaled. There are also costs, and those costs should be acknowledged honestly. But the alternative, letting wrongdoing be normalized by applause, is a cost none of us can afford to internalize. When people ask me what I would tell a mother who finds herself at that table about to make the choice I once made, I tell them 3 things. Preserve the moment if you can, protect the witness, and find your allies. Preservation is practical, the recording, the timestamp, the photographs. Protection is tactical, safety planning, supportive counsel, and medical attention when needed. Allies are the matrix that provides sustenance, a counselor, a trusted law enforcement contact, friends who will bear witness. Ariana's decision to speak publicly and to work in safety reforms feels like the most honest way to honor what happened. It is not about punishment, it is about prevention. We have tried, in our modest ways, to make the path toward protection less lonely and less costly. So what of Helen and Mark now? They're part of the public record, subject to sentencing and supervision. Their names are attached to legal filings and to appellate dockets. The convictions are not a panacea, they are a public designation of wrongdoing that created consequences. I cannot promise that every case will end the way ours did. Justice is never guaranteed, but I can say that the discipline of preservation, the courage of witnesses like Albert, and the steady application of legal process mattered. And in the soft coda of our story, the scene I return to in my mind, my daughter sits across from me at a table, warming the house with familiar smells. We speak of small things, the new herb plant she's coaxing along, an idea for a lab improvement she wants to test, an invitation to a low-key concert. The world did not repair itself in a single motion. We repaired ourselves in increments, leaning into ordinary life and filling it with attention and care. If you are watching this and you carry a story that is raw and private, know this: you are not required to carry it alone. There are processes that can help, people who will bear witness, and ways to preserve the truth. If you need a place to start, reach out to local resources. Find a lawyer who understands both law and the human cost, and connect with survivors who have built community. If this story resonates with you, please consider sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. True love never hurts. That is the simplest sentence I can leave you with, both a moral and a boundary. Love protects, not punishes. Love invites trust, not control. When love crosses into harm, the obligation is not merely to endure, but to act to keep someone safe. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who might need it. Subscribe for more stories of survival, law, and recovery. And if you need resources, seek out local advocates who can help with safety planning and legal referrals. We are not alone in this fight. The work of protection and justice is a collective endeavor. Thank you for listening.